So, let me begin with a quote from the website of the Nobel Prizes. Henry Dunant's life, 1828 to 1910, is a study in contrasts. He was born into a wealthy home but died in a hospice. In middle age, he juxtaposed great fame with total obscurity and success in business with bankruptcy. In old age, he was virtually exiled from the Genevan society of which he had once been an ornament and died in a lonely room, leaving a bitter testament. His passionate humanitarianism was the one constant in his life, and the Red Cross his living monument. And so that is from the Nobel Prize website, because Dunant was the joint winner of the very first Nobel Peace Prize in 1901. So what is the story behind this remarkable Swiss man who founded the Red Cross movement? Because most Christians have never heard of him, or if they have, they had no idea that he was a Christian. So let's try and tell his story. The Dunants were a well-off family from Geneva, rooted in their Calvinist tradition and very much committed to demonstrating their faith through social work. And to them, in 1828 was born John Henry, the oldest of 5 children. He went to the Collège of Calvin, the one I already showed you, in Geneva, founded by the great reformer himself, and yet he was asked to leave when he was 14 for repeatedly failing his exams, even though he had won the prize for piety on several occasions. So his own personal devotion was exemplary, but when it came to passing his Latin exams, he just couldn't do it. So he was regrettably asked to leave. So after this, he devoted himself to participating in the activities of the Reformed Church and was drawn into the evangelical Réveil movement, which had begun 30 years earlier with the revival of the Scotsman Robert Haldane in Geneva. And around the age of 18, Dunant made a personal commitment of his life to the Lord Jesus at the Oratoire Church, which still stands there today, which was the center of the movement, of the Réveil movement in Geneva. Soon after this, he set up the Thursday Association, which gathered young men for Bible study and to reach out in social action in various ways. He spent a lot of his time visiting the sick and the poorest of the poor, prisoners in the city jail who were serving their sentences in desperate conditions. He would read the Bible to them and also read stories of travel and adventure and really come alongside them. But as many of you know, evangelism and social work don't earn a living. And so, age 21, his parents found an apprenticeship for Henry in a banking house in Geneva called Lulin and Sauter. And this enabled him in the business of the bank to travel freely to France, connect with other groups of young Christians with a shared similar vision. In 1851, the Thursday Association, which he'd founded, sent 2 medical students to Paris to organize similar gatherings there. And a while later, the association was renamed the Union Chrétienne de Jeunes Gens, UCJG, which allied itself with the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, which was the organization founded in London in 1844 by George Williams, which had a very similar vision and ethos, but was working in the English-speaking world. So Dunant in Geneva started this French-speaking movement, similar vision and values, so he said, come on, let's be allied. And effectively, it became the French-speaking branch of the YMCA. Now, very much like Just Love, which is founded just a few years ago by students, these groups were organized and run by the young people themselves for prayer, Bible study, growing in their faith, and organizing evangelistic outreach and practical service. And their meeting place in Geneva was marked by this plaque. That was Dunant in his 20s. And here in the old city of Geneva, it shows this is where it was founded in 1852. So all Dunant's spare time and much of his salary went into the work of these Christian unions. They ran social activities which brought young Christians together from different backgrounds in a unique kind of society. So it must have been absolutely fantastic to be part of these. In his work of supporting these unions, he went to the Netherlands in 1851 when he was 23 and helped encourage a new group there and he was fast becoming one of the leading figures of this movement on the continent. However, alongside his gifts were some glaring weaknesses also. One of his co-leaders wrote to his brother in Paris, "My task has not always been an easy one. I had Dunant to restrain. What a pity it is that he is so lacking in judgment. He has amazing zeal and energy. How I wish this dear friend of ours had rather more common sense, tact and judgment." Very telling as a young man, because those same combination of strengths and weaknesses were played out on a much larger scale a bit later in his life. Now, in 1853, the Christian unions of France, Belgium and Switzerland were keen to form a French-speaking federation, but Dunant objected, proposing there should be one global movement with the English-speaking YMCAs, which had spread from London to the United States and to Australia. So his vision prevailed, partly because he wrote frequently about his vision and ideas, which were published in the international newsletter of these Christian unions. And in the end, Dunant helped write the charter of the International YMCA, which held its first global congress in Paris in 1855. Now, the year 1853 was significant for Dunant in two other ways. First, he met the American author Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Have any of you read that book, Uncle Tom's Cabin? Yes, several of you. This book had brought the harsh realities of life as an American slave to a wide audience. And from that point onwards, Dunant was a firm abolitionist, and he promoted the cause wherever he went. Secondly, in 1853, Dunant's work with the bank took him to the French colony of Algeria as a temporary manager in the Colonie Suisse de Sétif, which was owned by the banking house he worked for. Despite his inexperience, he succeeded in his task and was sent out again in 1854. He was intoxicated by the culture of the Orient and wrote a book which was well received about his experience. Through other writings, he began to be seen as a man of letters and was admitted to several learned societies, a remarkable achievement for someone with his academic record at school and also his age. When he was 27, Dunant decided to hand over the work of fostering the YMCA branches to others and to concentrate on his business career. Now, spurred on by his success in managing the work in Algeria of the bank, he set up his own company and took a concession on 77 hectares of fertile agricultural land from the French colonial authority for cultivating wheat. His vision was to grind flour from his own farms and neighbouring ones in a big mill and export the flour back into France and Switzerland. And this enterprise needed a substantial amount of capital, and he used his connections with many of the wealthy families in Geneva and his parents' circle to raise 500,000 francs. Of course, 500,000 francs in the 1850s is probably more like 20 or 30 million now. I don't know. Oh no, Swiss inflation. Maybe 1 million now. Okay. He went and built the mill for grinding the flour, despite not having obtained permission to access the water he needed to power the mills and irrigate the land. So he was kind of putting the cart before the horse, and he built this huge mill before having any wheat to grind or any water to irrigate the fields, to grow the wheat, to grind in the mill. Now, in 1859, he managed to double the capital of his promising venture, but he still lacked the vital water. His impatience with the bureaucracy and slowness of the colonial administration reached the point when he decided to take matters to the top. He would present his case to the Emperor, Napoleon III. Now, at that time, June 1859, he found out that Napoleon was in northern Italy, leading the French army and its Italian allies against the Austrians, who had occupied northern Italy since 1815. And when Dunant arrived, he witnessed the aftermath of one of the 19th century's bloodiest battles on June the 24th, 1859. More than 40,000 people had been killed or injured in that battle, many just being left to die where they fell. Dunant was shocked, and quickly putting aside his business mission, he immediately got involved, bringing water, arranging supplies, getting the victorious French army to release Austrian doctors that they were holding prisoner, so they could care for the wounded, writing down last words from dying soldiers to send to their families, and mobilizing local people to tend the wounded from both sides. The week he spent there was to change the course of the 31-year-old's life. Back in Geneva, Dunant was haunted by what he had seen, and as a result, he wrote his thoughts and reflections down in a book called A Memory of Solferino. Now, this book had 3 parts. The first part, he described the glories of the battle, which is actually how most reports of war in the mid-19th century were presented. So he lured people in with, yes, glorious, wonderful, fantastic, this is what happens when you go to war. The kind of typical recruitment messages, probably. But then he changed tactics, and in the second part of the book, he spoke of the hideous aftermath and what he had witnessed, the immense suffering of the wounded, so much of which could have been alleviated with a few simple policies and preparations. And then in the last part of the book, he set out a triple appeal, because he'd thought through, well, what do we need to do? He said, during peacetime, societies should be formed of volunteers who would be prepared to go and assist on the battlefield. Secondly, those volunteer doctors and nurses should be afforded protection and assistance on the battlefield to do this vital work. And thirdly, governments should formulate certain international principles and conventions which would allow the development of these societies to care for the war wounded in different European countries. Dunant printed this book in 1862 at his own expense and sent it around all his networks, to the YMCA, to his business circles, to leading families, to royalty and aristocracy in different countries. His challenge stirred many hearts, especially in his own city of Geneva. And as a result, something called the Geneva Society for Public Utility took up this cause and formed a committee in 1863, of which Dunant, on the top right there, was one of the 5 members. And this committee looked into how to implement the ideas set out in his book. And Dunant was the secretary, and he devoted himself to mobilizing people behind the vision of what would eventually become the International Red Cross. Now, a year later, largely through Dunant's efforts, the same committee convened an international conference of 16 nations in Geneva to discuss the possibility of making warfare more humane. And in August 1864, the representatives of 12 of those nations signed the very first Geneva Convention. So, over a period of 5 years, Henry Dunant saw a personal vision transformed into an international treaty. But only 3 years later, before he turned 40, Dunant went bankrupt, as he had neglected his business in Algeria because of his work with the promoting the Red Cross movement. And the result of that is that he was ostracized by the Calvinist Genevan Society, which considered defaulting on a debt one of the worst crimes you could commit. And so he left Geneva to spend the remaining 43 years of his life mostly in poverty and obscurity. And this was in part because the other members of the committee, and especially Gustave Moynier, who was the guy top left, he was bitterly opposed to Dunant, and he sought to rewrite the history of the Red Cross movement over subsequent years, absolutely downplaying Dunant's role and kind of elevating the role of the rest of them, because the others were all very well-known people, and he was the young upstart, but who had the brilliant visionary idea and the ability to mobilize, to inspire, to get people behind that vision. But he was now bankrupt. The other members of the committee, wanted to downplay his influence and marginalize his role. And he then spent the next 3 or 4 decades rallying behind other causes, but never really being able to shake off this shame and the burden of basically they were hounding him for these debts all around Europe, and wherever he managed to raise a bit of money, he was felt compelled to use it to pay off his debts. So this sorry tale came to a slightly happier ending, because in the mid-1890s he was discovered, and he was a broken man, and he'd taken what you might call early retirement over on the German side of Switzerland. And he was discovered by a newspaper editor who was on holiday from St. Gallen, who published an article about Dunant's role in establishing the Red Cross. And, and this spread around European newspapers, and he received renewed attention and support. And as a result of that, he received a number of rewards and prizes, which culminated in that first Nobel Peace Prize in 1901. And he died in 1910. His legacy, or his testament, was still, he was very bitter about what had happened to him. He was bitter against the institutions of the state and the organized church. And even though he called himself right to the end a disciple of Jesus, it was a very sort of simple, pure sort of idea of just following Jesus personally. But he really struggled and never was reconciled with the city of Geneva, and was never able to overcome the this bankruptcy effectively. But also, having read his character reference, you could see he had some fatal flaws. So this extraordinary combination of great talent, but also some fatal flaws there. And I find it somehow a fascinating story, because I can see, or I don't know, I've experienced in my life as well, great opportunities, some things I've done really well, and other times I've just blown it just because of my own weaknesses. And I can sort of, although I've done absolutely nothing like Dunant, there's something about his story that I can identify with. And so I think it is an extraordinary story, which, if you look at the subsequent development of, you see, Geneva, because of the work of the Red Cross, became a place more and more, it helped to develop Geneva's neutrality. More and more countries came to Geneva to kind of work on resolving conflicts. And Switzerland, its reputation, its neutrality was augmented by this sense of they are really good at dealing with conflict and bringing peace, which is why the League of Nations in 1918, after the First World War, was established with its headquarters in Geneva, and then during and after the Second World War, as that sort of morphed into the United Nations, again, its main, even though the technical headquarters are in New York, but most of the work of the United Nations is done from Geneva. So, you could say that, so much of that was down. Sorry. So much of that was down really to the extraordinary character of Henry Dunant, his perseverance, his vision, his single-mindedness, his ability to somehow be absolutely reckless in following his calling and his passion. But also, you see, the way that God engineered these extraordinary circumstances. And you can see as well the providence of God equipping him through the things he'd done, through his experience, even through his earlier failures. He was being equipped for the extraordinary work of getting the Red Cross established and getting the Geneva Convention signed. So you can see God was absolutely at work. Do you call it providence? I mean, he was not looking to be a humanitarian, but he landed on the battlefield of Solferino, trying to sort out his business problems. And that encounter, God used to change his life around. So I think it's a remarkable story of someone who I would say is a Christian social reformer, even though his faith, was really tested and he struggled, and there was, especially in the latter half of his life. But lots of lessons there. I won't say any more. I've given you some of my sort of interpretations of it, but I think there are some really important things to be reflecting on and thinking about and learning.